Tuesday morning, warm enough that the air in Brentwood felt like it had been sitting still all night. Marilyn Monroe was still in her robe, hair loosely pinned, when the mail arrived. She didn't usually get herself. The maid would bring it in, set on the coffee table, and leave it there until Marilyn felt ready. But today, she opened the door. A white envelope sat on top of the small stack, standing out like it had been placed there on purpose. No return address, no stamp, just her name in neat, deliberate handwriting. Marilyn Monroe, not Norma Jeane, not Miss Monroe. Whoever had written it knew exactly who they were speaking to, and exactly how to speak to her. She turned it over in her hands as she walked back inside, her bare feet making no sound on the carpet. The rest of the mail slid onto the table without a glance. She sat on the couch, pulling her robe tighter, and studied the envelope for a long moment before sliding her finger under the flap. Inside was a single black and white photograph. It was of her, or at least it looked like her, standing in the shadow of a building, her face half hidden, looking over her shoulder. The background was unfamiliar, and yet something about it made her stomach tighten. On the back of the photo, in the same precise handwriting as the envelope, were two words. We both know. Her first instinct was to laugh, a small, brittle sound that didn't even make it past her lips. She put the photo down, lit a cigarette, and stared at the smoke curling upward. She could name a dozen people who might send something like this. Old lovers, studio rivals, strangers who thought they knew her because they had memorized her smile on a movie poster. But the truth was, the real list was shorter and more dangerous. She picked the photo back up, held it closer. The shadows in the picture seemed too deliberate, the kind a photographer created when they wanted to hide something and reveal something else at the same time. Her pulse quickened, not from fear exactly, but from recognition. The phone rang in the bedroom, sudden and sharp. She didn't move to answer it. Instead, she placed the photograph back in the envelope, tucked it into the drawer of her vanity, and closed it with a soft click. Outside, a car drove past slowly, its engine low and steady. She glanced at the curtains, but the sunlight was too bright to see clearly. For the rest of the morning, the envelope stayed hidden, but the words on the back of the photo played in her mind over and over. We both know, by noon, Marilyn understood something she didn't want to say out loud. Whatever the envelope meant, it wasn't over. It was just the beginning. By the following morning, Marilyn had convinced herself she wouldn't think about the envelope. She told herself it was nothing. A prank, a misguided fan, maybe even a piece of old publicity material that somehow found its way into her hands. She was used to strange things arriving in her life without explanation. Fame did that. But the problem with a message like we both know was that it didn't fade the way ordinary letters did. It hung in the air, invisible but heavy, like perfume that lingered long after the person wearing it had left the room. She spent the morning at her vanity, applying her makeup with slow precision. Foundation, powder, eyeliner, all the little rituals that made her face ready for the outside world. But every time she looked up into the mirror, she half expected to see the words written there in lipstick. The phone rang twice before she picked it up. Hello? The line was silent at first, the faint crackle of distance filling her ear. Then, a male voice, calm, unhurried. I know you got it. She froze. Who is this? But there was only the click of the line, going dead. She sat there for a long moment, receiver still in hand, until the dial tone started humming like an alarm. Then she hung up, lit a cigarette, and opened the vanity drawer. The envelope was exactly where she'd left it, the photograph inside unchanged. Yet, holding it now, she noticed something she hadn't before. In the far corner of the image, barely visible in the shadows, was the shape of another person. A man. She reached for her glasses and leaned closer. The figure was out of focus, but the stance was unmistakable, standing slightly turned, as if watching her. The phone rang again. This time she didn't answer. By mid-afternoon, she'd given up pretending it wasn't getting to her. She poured herself a glass of champagne and walked out to the balcony, letting the warm air brush against her skin. Below, the street looked ordinary. a couple walking their dog, a boy on a bicycle, the mailman making his rounds. But each face felt like a question. Did they know? Were they watching? When the maid returned from errands, Marilyn asked casually if she'd seen anyone near the house the day before. The woman hesitated before shaking her head. Marilyn noticed the hesitation. That evening, she took the envelope from the vanity drawer and moved it to the nightstand beside her bed. She told herself it was so she could look at it and finally prove it meant nothing. But she didn't look. Not yet. She just kept it close. The way some people keep a loaded gun in the drawer. Not because they want to use it, but because not having it within reach feels worse. As she drifted towards sleep, the words echoed again, not in handwriting this time, but in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. We both know. And Marilyn understood something she hadn't admitted to herself before. It wasn't the we that scared her. It was the no. For 3 days, the envelope stayed on her nightstand like a guest who refused to leave. Marilyn tried not to touch it, but her eyes kept drifting toward it, especially in the late hours when the house went still. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night and swear she'd left it facing one way, only to find it turned another. She told herself it was the maid or her own forgetfulness, but the thought didn't settle. Her days became strange, broken into fragments. A short meeting with her publicist in the morning, where she smiled too brightly, made jokes that landed too flat. Lunch with a friend who kept glancing at her like she was studying a crack in porcelain. And always, the unshakable feeling that someone was just outside her line of sight. The phone calls began again. Always short, always nothing on the other end but a breath. Sometimes one ring, sometimes 3. The rhythm began to feel deliberate, like some kind of code. She stopped answering entirely, but the ringing still filled the house, threading its way through the walls like a vein. One afternoon, she decided to prove to herself there was nothing to fear. She opened the envelope, studied the photograph again. This time she noticed something else, a faint reflection in a nearby window within the image. It was her, and yet it wasn't. The angle was wrong. The expression was unfamiliar. It looked like she was watching herself. That night, the dream came. She was walking through a studio set, but the lights were dim, the crew gone. In the distance, she saw herself in costume, smiling, waving. She called out, but the other Marilyn didn't answer. She just turned and disappeared behind a curtain. When Marilyn followed, there was nothing, only a white envelope on the floor. She knelt to open it, but inside was not a photo. It was a mirror, and the face staring back at her wasn't hers. She woke gasping, her robe tangled around her legs, the phone ringing in the dark. She didn't answer. By morning, she was certain of 2 things. First, that whoever had sent the envelope was still watching. Second, that it was no longer about the photograph. The message was deeper, threaded through her days and nights until it was impossible to tell where it ended and she began. That afternoon, while stepping out onto the balcony, she noticed a car parked at the far end of the street, the same one she'd glimpsed before. She stared at it for nearly a minute. The driver never moved. She went back inside, closed the curtains, and poured herself a drink. But even with a glass in her hand, her mind wouldn't let go of a single gnawing truth. If the quiet around her had turned hostile, there was nowhere left to hide. The 4th night after the envelope arrived, Marilyn stopped pretending she could sleep. She stayed in her robe, sitting on the couch with the curtains drawn, the television on but muted, a silent movie for an audience of 1. A single lamp lit the room, casting long shadows across the walls. The envelope was on the coffee table in front of her, the photograph just peeking out of the opening, as if it, too, wanted to watch her. It was a little past midnight when the phone rang. 3 rings. A pause. 2 rings. Another pause. She stared at it, her hand hovering just above the receiver, and then let it fall back into her lap. The ringing stopped. She stood and moved to the kitchen for a glass of water. The tiles cool under her bare feet. That's when she heard it, the faint metallic rattle of her front gate. She froze, the glass in her hand trembling. The sound came again, followed by the whisper of footsteps on gravel. Marilyn turned off the kitchen light and stepped toward the window. The curtains were slightly parted, just enough to see the outline of a figure standing near her front door. Not moving, not knocking, just there. Her first instinct was to call the police. But the phone was in the living room, and to get to it she would have to pass the door. So she waited, pressed flat against the wall, listening. The seconds stretched. Then, a sound that turned her blood cold. The faint scratch of something sliding under her door. When she finally moved, she did it in silence, crossing the living room and kneeling to see what had been pushed through. It was another envelope, white, identical to the first. Her hands shook as she picked it up. This one was heavier. She carried it to the couch, set it on the table beside the first, and just stared. Opening it felt like an irreversible step, but not opening it, that felt worse. She slid a finger under the flap. Inside was no photograph this time, only a strip of black and white film negatives, neatly rolled and held with a paper band. Her stomach tightened. She unrolled it slowly, holding it up toward the lamplight. The frames showed her, candid shots taken from a distance, walking into her house, standing on her balcony, sitting in her living room. The last frame made her breath catch. It was from this very night, her standing at the kitchen sink, glass in hand. She dropped the negatives onto the table and stood, backing away from them. Her eyes went to the window. The street looked empty now, but she knew better. Whoever had taken those pictures had been close enough to hear the water running. The phone rang again. This time she answered. Silence. Then a voice, low and deliberate. We both know, and we're not done. The line went dead. Marilyn stood in the quiet, the envelope still open on the table, the negative spilling out like proof of something she hadn't wanted to believe. The line had been crossed. From this moment on, it wasn't about messages or photographs. It was about proximity, and they were closer than she had ever imagined. By morning, the second envelope still sat on the coffee table, the strip of negatives beside it like an accusation she couldn't ignore. Marilyn hadn't slept. She had moved from the couch to the bedroom and back again, never turning on more than one light at a time, never standing near a window for too long. Her Brentwood home had always been a sanctuary, a place where she could share the role of Marilyn Monroe and just be Norma Jeane. But now, every wall felt thinner. Every room seemed to have corners that were just a little too dark. She caught herself listening for things she'd never noticed before. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, the shifting creak of the floorboards as the house cooled. Each sound became suspicious, as though the building itself was holding its breath to hear her. By noon, she pulled the curtains tight and unplugged the phone. The silence that followed should have been a relief. It wasn't. The absence of ringing made her realize how much she had been listening for it. She wandered into the bedroom and sat at the vanity. The mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized, her hair slightly unkempt, eyes ringed with sleeplessness, lipstick smudged at the corner of her mouth. She thought about fixing it, but the idea of painting herself into the image the world expected felt exhausting. On impulse, she opened a vanity drawer and took out the first envelope, laying it beside the second. The two sat there like a pair of silent witnesses. She picked up the photograph from the first, then the negatives from the second, comparing them. The angle in the last negative still gnawed at her. Whoever took it had been inside her yard. That afternoon, she stepped outside for the first time in 2 days. The sun was too bright, almost aggressive. She walked to the gate and looked at the street. No car, no figure, just the slow movement of life. A neighbor watering her plants, a man jogging with his dog. Normal. Too normal. She stayed outside for only a minute before retreating back in, locking the door behind her. The lock felt small, insufficient. As evening settled, the shadows in the house grew long, stretching like fingers across the floor. She moved from room to room, turning on every light, but the brightness only made the darkness at the edges seem sharper. That's when she noticed it. The gardenia. It was on the coffee table, in a small glass of water. She hadn't put it there. She hadn't even seen it before today. She stared at it, heart thudding. The petals were perfect, the stem freshly cut. Whoever left it had been close enough to place it inside her home without her knowing. Her first instinct was to throw it away. Instead, she sat down across from it, like it was a message she needed to study. Her mind kept circling back to the words on the first photograph. We both know. Now, she thought, maybe it wasn't just the two of them anymore. Maybe there were more. That night, she lay in bed with the envelopes on her nightstand, the gardenia between them. She didn't close her eyes for a long time. And when she finally did, she dreamed of a house with no doors, just windows, and faces pressed against every one of them. The dream clung to her long after she woke. The house without doors, every window framed by silent faces. For the first few minutes of the morning, she stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, willing the image to fade. It didn't. She reached for the envelopes on her nightstand. They felt heavier than before, as if holding them too long might pull her under. The gardenia between them had started to wilt overnight, one petal curling in on itself like it was trying to hide. When she finally stood, the air in the house felt different. Not colder exactly, but closer, thicker. She walked to the living room and stopped. The curtains were open. She hadn't opened them. Outside, the street was empty. But in the distance, just at the edge of her vision, a dark shape moved out of view. Her hands shook as she closed the curtains again. She went to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and turned to find the envelopes on the counter. She knew she had left them in the bedroom. She told herself it was a maid, but the maid wasn't due until tomorrow. By mid-afternoon, she decided she couldn't stay inside. She put on oversized sunglasses, a scarf over her hair, and drove. Nowhere in particular. Just away. She took side streets, doubled back, watched the mirrors. At a red light, she glanced to her left. A man in a sedan was watching her. Not casually. Not like someone who just noticed a celebrity. Watching her the way a predator watches something that doesn't know it's already been chosen. She turned quickly, pulling into a crowded gas station. By the time she looked again, the sedan was gone. But when she returned home an hour later, the gardenia was gone too. In its place, on the coffee table, was a new photograph. No envelope this time, just the picture. It was of her in the driver's seat of her car that very afternoon. Sunglasses, scarf, one hand on the wheel, taken from the passenger side window. Taken so close she could see her own pulse in her neck. Her knees went weak. She sat on the couch, the photograph in her lap, staring at the open space where the gardenia had been. The watchers weren't at the edges anymore. They were right here, inside the glass. The photograph from the car stayed in her hands long after the sun went down. She didn't remember getting up to turn on the lights, but the house was lit now, every lamp burning, as if she could push back the darkness by force. It didn't help. The shadows just clung to the walls, waiting for her eyes to slip away so they could move closer. She thought about calling someone, the police, a friend, anyone who might stand in her doorway and make the air feel lighter. But the thought unraveled as quickly as it came. What could she say? That someone had left her flowers and photographs? That they'd been inside without breaking a lock? It all sounded too much like the kind of thing people nodded at politely and forgot about. By midnight, she'd stopped moving from room to room. Instead, she sat on the floor in the hallway, back against the wall, where she could see both the front door and the bedroom. The envelopes were on the carpet beside her, stacked like evidence no one would believe. The phone rang 3 times. She didn't answer. It rang again 20 minutes later. 2 rings this time. Then silence. She closed her eyes, just for a second. That's when she heard it, faint but unmistakable, breathing, not her own. It came from somewhere close, too close. She held her breath, listening. It faded, then returned as if the house itself had lungs. Her eyes moved the front door. The gap under was thin, but enough for a shadow to pass across. And one just did. She stood slowly, her pulse hammering. The shadow moved again, this time in the opposite direction, and then nothing. But when she turned back toward the hallway, she froze. The gardenia was there again, lying neatly on the carpet just inches from the envelopes. She didn't hear the door open. She didn't hear it close. Yet someone had been inside. Her breathing grew uneven. She backed into the bedroom and locked the door, as if that could matter now. The gardenia stayed in the hall, just beyond the thin wood between them. That night, she slept with the lights on. And in her dreams, the house had no walls anymore, just windows, and behind every one a face. It began before midnight. The first sound was a faint squeal of tires somewhere far off. Then, minutes later, the low hum of an engine idling too close to her house. Marilyn lay in bed, the light still on, staring at the ceiling. The envelopes were on the nightstand, the gardenia beside them like a sentinel. She didn't get up when the phone rang. She didn't get up when it rang again, but she did when it rang a third time. She picked up the receiver slowly. Silence. Then, the same voice she had heard before. "We both know. Tonight, you'll understand." The line went dead. She set the phone down, her hands trembling. From the hallway came a sound, not a knock, not footsteps, but the quiet scrape of something along the wall. She stood, moving to the doorway, listening. The sound drifted toward the living room, then stopped. When she reached the living room, she froze. Every curtain was open. The street outside was empty, but her reflection in the glass was surrounded by movement. Faint shapes shifting in the edges. She stepped closer, trying to focus. That's when she realized it wasn't outside. It was behind her. She turned sharply, but the room was empty. Only the coffee table, and on it, a third envelope. No name, no seal. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of her in this very moment, standing at the window, opening an envelope. Her knees went weak. She dropped the photo and backed away, eyes darting to every corner. The walls felt wrong, too close, too soft, as if they could breathe. Somewhere outside, the car engine started again. A door shut, then silence. She moved quickly to the bedroom, locking the door. The gardenia was gone from the nightstand. In its place was a folded piece of paper. She opened it, for words, handwritten in the same perfect script as before. "We can see you." The lights flickered. For a moment, the room was black. When they came back, she was alone. But she knew alone was no longer possible. That night, the watchers didn't need to be outside. They were in every reflection, every shadow, every part of her that couldn't be locked away. And when the morning came, the envelopes were gone, but the gardenia was back, perfectly fresh, in a glass of water on the table. They will tell you Marilyn Monroe died in August of 1962, alone in her Brentwood home. They will give you the time, the cause, and the headlines. They will tell you about the pills, the champagne, and the empty phone lines. What they won't tell you is about the envelopes. The first with photograph, the second with film negatives, the third with a picture taken in a moment that had not yet happened. They will not speak about the gardenia that appeared and disappeared as if carried by invisible hands. They will not mention the voice on the phone, the one that knew her name before the world did. They will never admit that the watchers may have stepped to the glass that last night and never stepped back. Marilyn Monroe was a woman trapped between two selves, the face in the mirror the world adored, and the eyes in the shadows that she could never escape. Her story has been told as a tragedy, as a scandal, as a puzzle, but maybe it was something else entirely, because there are still people who swear they saw her days after her death, standing at her window with the curtains wide open, and there are some who believe the envelopes never stopped coming. The truth? We both know